ended within a year after a riot in Edinburgh, stoked by anti-Catholicism, led the court to withdraw to Linlithgow temporarily. One last Scottish attempt against the king's person occurred in August 1600, when James was apparently assaulted by Alexander Ruthven, the Earl of Gowrie's younger brother, at Gowrie House, the seat of the Ruthvens. Since Ruthven was run through by James's page John Ramsay and the Earl of Gowrie was himself killed in the ensuing fracas, there were few surviving witnesses. Given his history with the Ruthvens, and that he owed them a great deal of money, James's account of the circumstances was not universally believed. In 1586, James signed the Treaty of Berwick with England. That and the execution of his mother in 1587, which he denounced as a preposterous and strange procedure, helped clear the way for his succession south of the border. Queen Elizabeth was unmarried and childless, and James was her most likely successor. Securing the English succession became a cornerstone of his policy. During the Spanish Armada crisis of 1588, he assured Elizabeth of his support as her natural son and compatriot of your country.
Marriage.
Throughout his youth, James was praised for his chastity, since he showed little interest in women. After the loss of Lennox, he continued to prefer male company. A suitable marriage, however, was necessary to reinforce his monarchy, and the choice fell on the 14-year-old Anne of Denmark, younger daughter of the Protestant Frederick II. Shortly after a proxy marriage in Copenhagen in August 1589, Anne sailed for Scotland but was forced by storms to the coast of Norway. On hearing the crossing had been abandoned, James, in what Jolson calls the one romantic episode of his life, sailed from Leith with a 300-strong retinue to fetch Anne personally. The couple were married formally at the Bishop's Palace in Oslo on November 23 and, after stays at Elsinore in Copenhagen and a meeting with Tycho Brahe, returned to Scotland on May 1, 1590. By all accounts, James was at first infatuated with Anne, and in the early years of their marriage seems always to have showed her patience and affection. The royal couple produced 3 children who survived to adulthood: Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, who died of typhoid fever in 1612, aged 18. Elizabeth, later Queen of Bohemia. And Charles, his successor. Anne died before her husband in March 1619.
Witch hunts.
James's visit to Denmark, a country familiar with witch hunts, may have encouraged an interest in the study of witchcraft, which he considered a branch of theology. After his return to Scotland, he attended the North Berwick witch trials, the first major persecution of witches in Scotland under the Witchcraft Act 1563. Several people, most notably Agnes Sampson, were convicted of using witchcraft to send storms against James's ship. James became obsessed with the threat posed by witches and, inspired by his personal involvement, in 1597 wrote the Daemonologies, a tract which opposed the practice of witchcraft and which provided background material for Shakespeare's tragedy of Macbeth. James personally supervised the torture of women accused of being witches. After 1599, his views become more skeptical. In a later letter written in England to his son Prince Henry, James congratulates the prince on the discovery of yon little counterfeit wench. I pray God ye may be my heir in such discoveries. Most miracles nowadays prove but illusions, and ye may see by this how wary judges should be in trusting accusations.
Highlands and Islands.
The forcible dissolution of the Lordship of the Isles by James IV in 1493 had led to troubled times for the western seaboard. Although the king had subdued the organized military might of the Hebrides, he and his immediate successors lacked the will or ability to provide an alternative form of governance. As a result, the 16th century became known as Lyn nan Creech, the time of raids. Furthermore, the effects of the Reformation were slow to impact the Gaeltacht, driving a religious wedge between this area and centers of political control in the Central Belt. In 1540 James V had toured the Hebrides, forcing the clan chiefs to accompany him. There followed a period of peace, but the clans were soon at loggerheads with one another again. During James VI's reign, the transformation of the 15th century image of the Hebrides as the cradle of Scottish Christianity and nationhood into one in which its citizens were regarded as lawless barbarians was complete. Official documents describe the peoples of the Highlands as void of the knowledge and fear of God, who were prone to all kind of barbarous and bestial cruelties. The Gaelic language, spoken fluently by James IV and probably by James V, became known in the time of James VI as Erse or Irish, implying that it was foreign in nature. The Scottish Parliament decided it had become a principal cause of the Highlanders' shortcomings and sought to abolish it. It was against this background that in 1598 James VI authorized the gentlemen adventurers of Fife to civilize the most barbarous Isle of Lewis. James wrote that the colonists were to act not by agreement with the local inhabitants, but by extirpation of them. The landing at Stornoway was initially successful, but the colonists were driven out by local forces commanded by Murdoch and Neil MacLeod. The colonists tried again in 1605 with the same result, although a third attempt in 1607 was more successful. The Statutes of Iona were enacted in 1609, which required clan chiefs to send their heirs to lowland Scotland to be educated in English-speaking Protestant schools, provide support for Protestant ministers to Highland parishes, outlaw bards, and regularly report to Edinburgh to answer for their actions. So began a process specifically aimed at the extirpation of the Gaelic language, the destruction of its traditional culture and the suppression of its bearers. In the Northern Isles, James's cousin Patrick Stewart, Earl of Orkney, resisted the Statutes of Iona, and was consequently imprisoned. His natural son, Robert, led an unsuccessful rebellion against James, and both the Earl and his son were hanged. Their estates were forfeited, and the Orkney and Shetland Islands were annexed to the Crown.
Theory of monarchy.
Indiana, 1597-98, James wrote The True Law of Free Monarchies and Basilicon Doran, Royal Gift, in which he argued a theological basis for monarchy. In The True Law, he sets out the divine right of kings, explaining that for biblical reasons kings are higher beings than other men, though the highest bench is the slighterest to sit upon. The document proposes an absolutist theory of monarchy, by which a king may impose new laws by royal prerogative but must also pay heed to tradition and to God, who would stir up such scourges as pleaseth him, for punishment of wicked kings. Basilicon Doran, written as a book of instruction for the 4-year-old Prince Henry, provides a more practical guide to kingship. The work is considered to be well written and perhaps the best example of James's prose. James's advice concerning parliaments, which he understood as merely the king's head court, foreshadows his difficulties with the English Commons. Hold no parliaments, he tells Henry, but for the necessity of new laws, which would be but seldom. In The True Law James maintains that the king owns his realm as a feudal lord owns his fief, because kings arose before any estates or ranks of men, before any parliaments were holden, or laws made, and by them was the land distributed, which at first was wholly theirs. And so it follows of necessity that kings were the authors and makers of the laws, and not the laws of the kings.
Literary patronage.
James was concerned in the 1580s and 1590s to promote the literature of the country of his birth. His treatise, Some Rules and Cautions to be Observed and issued in Scottish prosody, published in 1584 at the age of 18, was both a poetic manual and a description of the poetic tradition in his mother tongue, Scots, applying Renaissance principles. He also made statutory provision to reform and promote the teaching of music, seeing the two in connection. In furtherance of these aims he was both patron and head of a loose circle of Scottish Jacobean court poets and musicians, the Castalian Band, which included among others William Fowler and Alexander Montgomery, the latter being a favourite of the king. James, himself a poet, was happy to be seen as a practising member in the group. By the late 1590s his championing of his native Scottish tradition was to some extent diffused by the increasingly expected prospect of inheritance of the English throne, and some courtier poets who followed the king to London after